I remember the afternoon everything started. No trumpet fanfare, just the small private sound of someone clipping hydrangeas. It was mid-June, and everyone's yards were suddenly the subject of the neighborhood's moral code. 1-inch trim this, native plants only that. I lived at the end of Meadowbrook Lane and had watched these front yards like a slow-motion crime show for years. Marissa Hale, our HOA president and low-key queen of aesthetics, had a weekly patrol, a brisk walk with a clipboard, and the moral certainty of someone who knew the exact Pantone of curb appeal. She liked to tell anyone who'd listen that standards preserved property values. She said it like a blessing, like a prayer. The odd thing was, she meant it. The first time she knocked on my door, I answered in jeans and a t-shirt, and she looked a little surprised I wasn't wearing anything linen. "Plant heights," she said, peering into my yard as if it could be cataloged. "They blocked the sightline at the corner. Code says," and she recited the rule like scripture. But her steps had never been the same when she went to Carl Benton's house. Carl's yard was rigid, military straight lines, hedges trimmed with the regret of a man who'd missed a drill. He'd retired from the Air Force and applied that discipline to everything, even his begonias. The difference, obviously, wasn't the grass. It was who slapped the tape measure on whose hedge. That week, the first violation notice went out. My garden gnomes, apparently Republican offenders against uniformity, had to go. Jen Morales, who lived 2 houses down and ran the PTA with the tenacity of a trial lawyer, posted a photo of my gnomes in the group chat with 3 laughing emojis and a single line. "Someone's about to go full cottagecore." It was supposed to be a joke. Maybe it was, but jokes in small towns have sticky edges. They gather and harden into things you can't chip away with a hobby knife. I folded the notice into my pocket like a guilty card I hadn't meant to play, and the thing I hadn't known then was how fast that paper would become history to fight over. I grew up thinking rules were a way of avoiding drama, not inventing it. But on Meadowbrook Lane, rules were currency. Whoever interpreted them first could buy leverage. When Marissa convened the board meeting that July, I went because it was one of those small-town compulsions. You go to watch people behave like politicians so you can tell the story later. The community room at the association building smelled like lemon cleaner and expectations. Theo Klein, our vice president and part-time lawyer who loved the sound of a clause, sat at the head like he'd already ruled a case. Diane Park, an architect who wore blazers like armor, passed around prints from the city's ordinances. Omar Diaz, our landscaper, came in for the practical angle. He's the man who knows the soil and the gossip, and he had the kind of grin that made you trust him even when you shouldn't. The agenda was what you'd expect: amenity fund, pool hours, holiday lights. Buried at the end, like a landmine disguised as a benign household chore, was yard compliance update. Marissa stood, buttoned her cardigan, and said, "We've all been receiving an increased number of complaints." She wasn't accusing anyone by name. She didn't need to. When she said "we," it included everyone in the room, except of course the people she planned to exclude. I watched her eyes flick toward my house, and then to Carl's, measuring reactions like the way someone measures a cake. The first person to speak was Jen, with a voice like a hand raised in class. She painted a picture of sidewalks obstructed by overgrowth, of kids no longer being able to see when they cross the street. She told the story about her son nearly tripping on a stray sprinkler hose. It was earnest. It became urgent when she mentioned the memorial bench near the cul-de-sac. Someone had painted it neon green last month and left it as a comfort spot for Lily Morales, her sister who died last winter. Marissa's lips thinned. A memorial bench is an emotional device. It's also a public object. And suddenly the conversation about hedges had teeth. The room divided along invisible lines: safety, remembrance, property values, but more importantly, along personality. In those lines, small towns reveal themselves: fierce protectors, calculated opportunists, and people who are just trying not to be the next target. After that meeting, whispered narratives leaked out like a broken pipe. Someone said Carl had conspired to get his hedge designated a sightline hazard because Marissa had threatened to fine him for a mailbox that didn't match the approved style. Another whispered that Jen had sought to preserve the bench because it made her look compassionate in a re-election year for PTA. My neighbor's girlfriend, Lila, swore she heard Marissa on the phone with a city official arguing over bench colors like a colonel arguing a battle plan. Nobody had any real proof, just angles, and angles become stories fast. The bench became the pivot. It had been a small thing, a wooden bench painted mint with a brass plaque. It had been installed hastily by friends carrying sadness like an armrest. Marissa didn't like the color, and that was fair. She didn't like anything out of the HOA's palette, but she made it personal in the meeting, calling the paint visual noise. Theo, ever the legalistic calm, raised a clause in the bylaws about unauthorized structures on common property. Diane frowned and said, "It's a public amenity." Omar shrugged and offered to repaint it in a neutral taupe on the HOA dime. That sounded reasonable, until someone found a receipt like a smoking gun. The receipt was for the paint Marissa had ordered last year in a secret credit card swap used for community event supplies, and the color name matched her living room curtains. I'd like to say I didn't care. I care. Humans collect trespasses the way they collect coffee mugs, some practical, some sentimental, and some with a crack from the last time they were used wrong. We began to take sides and measure our intentions in private texts. He painted the bench without permission. One text read, "Did you see her curtains?" read another. You could feel the neighborhood shifting. It's small things that escalate. A bench is only a bench until it's a symbol. Suddenly, every dog walk, lawnmower starting, and late-night barbecued burger was an act under scrutiny. We began to look at each other as if we were understudies in a play about belonging, and everyone wanted the lead. There was a turning point that felt petty in the moment but later read like a fissure. It was a Saturday morning, and I was walking my dog when I saw Carl by his fence, measuring the slats like a man appraising a coffin. The fence was new, white picket, taller than the HOA's guidelines allowed by 3 inches. He had a permit, or at least he said he did. People love permits. They're proof that you followed the rules, even when you didn't. Marissa's face when she saw the fence was something I'd seen before, a person betrayed by an appliance. She took a long breath and said, "That's not what we agreed." Carl, who rarely surrendered, simply looked at her and said, "I measured the property line, Marissa. I own this." He said it like a gavel. That weekend the notice arrived. Violation. Marissa had written a letter that used commas like a hammer. Carl replied with a certified letter and a map, and Theo drafted a polite but firm counter that made legalese sound like popcorn. Jen, who had been quietly neutral, sent a mass email suggesting a community vote on fence heights. The vote was supposed to be democratic, but democracy in a HOA is often a negotiation between people who can wield debt collectors and people who can make excellent lemon bars for meetings. We were not equal in influence. I watched people show their teeth. Diane, who'd always been kind to me over garden edging suggestions, cornered me and said quietly, "We can't let one person set a precedent." Her voice made it plain what she meant. If Carl got his taller fence, anyone could. The metaphor crept in. Neighbors began imagining a chain reaction of taller fences and ugly vinyl porches. The idea of beauty, of the lane's curated sameness, had become the scaffolding for people's sense of security, but it was a fragile security, propped up by soft judgments and stronger verbal wills. The fence had become a symbol of sovereignty, a line in the ground that, once crossed, would make everyone have to re-explain who they were. I wasn't immune to the lure of theater. I attended the special meeting on fence regulation like a curious juror. The attendance was high. People who rarely came to anything showed up with folding chairs and a kind of moral glow. Kids rolled their eyes and played on smartphones. The older ones sat with the gravity of people who had paid mortgage interest for decades and wanted something reliable in return. Marissa spoke first and argued for uniformity. Fences must be X height, X material, no exceptions. She spoke like a woman who believed neatness prevented chaos. Carl stood up and said, plainly, "My family needs privacy." That line landed. We nodded, because privacy is a primary religion in suburbia. Jen brought up the bench again, which is what you do in neighborhood politics. You anchor your side to something human. She said, "We didn't normalize grief into a political tool." It was directed at Marissa without saying the name, which in small crowds is the worst kind of accusation. Theo suggested mediation. Diane suggested a design committee. Omar offered to create a modular bench plan that could be approved. It felt like a circus of solutions where each participant tried to show they were the reasonable one. After hours of debate, we voted on a compromise, a specific fence height allowance with a clause for exceptions if the board approved in writing. The measure passed by 5 votes to 3, and the collective exhale in the room sounded like a town who'd narrowly escaped a storm. It was neither satisfying nor decisive. It created paperwork, and in our world, paperwork is the smell of future conflict. Later that night, someone, who remains anonymous on purpose, left a note on Carl's porch. "Privacy is for people who have something to hide." It was childish and mean, and it made the stakes feel suddenly personal. Carl's temper simmered. We were all aware that anger has a way of turning small affronts into permanent scars. That anonymous note turned neighborhood gossip from simmer to boil. People texted me because I had a way of telling stories that made them feel less guilty about prying. "Who would do that?" they texted. "No one knows who did it, and of course they didn't." The best thing about a small community is deniability. The worst is the same. Carl suspected Theo's wife's cousin. Marissa suspected an overzealous volunteer. Jen suspected a troll. I suspected everyone and no one, because belief is contagious and we were all sniffing for reasons to feel vindicated. There were quieter acts of petty revenge, too. Someone moved Diane's garden gnome one morning and placed it on her stoop with a post-it that read, "Neutral territory." Someone else started parking on the street in a way that had the subtle inconvenience of a sand in a shoe. These were minor but meaningful. They were gestures that announced presence, a way to say, "I see you. I remember you." The board proposed a mediation session with a professional facilitator. It seemed like something out of a corporate HR manual, but we were willing. Mediation, in theory, is where you put your grievances in a jar and let someone else sort them. In reality, it's where small grievances learn to inflate into character indictments. The facilitator, a woman named Eileen, sat in our community room with a clipboard and a kind voice. She asked each person to describe their needs. Carl talked about privacy and family. Marissa talked about preserving the neighborhood's cohesive look. Jen talked about empathy and the bench. Theo talked about liability. Diane talked about precedent. Omar, who had been busy moving plants and moving secrets between yards, spoke about maintenance costs and the danger of turning common spaces into private memorials. You could feel the room trying to stitch together fabric that had been torn by 1,000 small pulls. It's funny. In mediation, you're forced to say what you already know in quieter language, but naming the hurts doesn't take them away. It just makes them audible. Around September, someone committed the social equivalent of arson. They posted a leak to the neighborhood's private online forum. It was a blurry photo of the bench during the dead of night, painted a bright blue that had no home in the HOA palette. The post included a caption implying Marissa had once ordered unauthorized paint, an old accusation repurposed as proof of hypocrisy. All of a sudden, every argument we'd had about color and control had photographic evidence. The comments section was a war zone of alibis and conspiracies. People who had never spoken in person typed things that were clever and cruel. I remember reading the thread at 2 a.m., lying on my couch, feeling the adrenaline of someone who has been tapped on the shoulder for an old debt. I posted a single line, "We're becoming less neighborly by the minute." It was obtuse and a little sanctimonious, but it was sincere. A friend replied with a gif of a popcorn bucket. That's the internet. You try to be human. Someone offers snacks. Meanwhile, in real life, Marissa received an anonymous letter with a smear of paint and a note, "Enjoy your palette." She took it personally, as she should. Painting someone's property is symbolic in a way breaking a window is not. It's saying, "I can alter what you curate." That night, our street felt like a courtroom and a battlefield at once. Some of us stood in driveways and pretended we weren't watching each other. Diane stopped speaking at board meetings and sent detailed architectural critiques by email instead. Theo started bringing legal briefs to casual gatherings. People began to invite only certain neighbors to holiday parties, which is where the social map redraws itself. Party list becomes power list. We ate alone at our own tables. The bench incident had an unexpected casualty, the annual block party. It used to be our simplest ritual. Potluck dishes, kids with juice boxes, fireflies, and folding chairs. That year we had a picnic with thin attendance and thicker agendas. Marissa tried to host it at her place, which some people saw as a power move. She insisted she was doing it for convenience and safety, an odd statement when your brand is aesthetic compliance. Jen refused to go unless the bench was acknowledged in a moment of silence. Carl brought his family and sat as far from Marissa as he could without being rude. We attempted a moment of silence. It lasted a beat longer than polite and then unraveled into ritualized statements. "We've lost someone," Jen said, speaking for the bench and for the unspoken losses of the neighborhood. "We have to be better." Marissa stood and thanked everyone for their commitment to appearance and mediation and law. It felt performative and honest at once. The kids ran between folding chairs, grabbing from paper plates, completely unaware that adults were measuring who belonged to which moral camp. After the speeches, a stack of paper plates went missing. That small theft, someone joked later it was a gnomish theft, became another tale. People speculated. Was it a sign of disrespect? A prank? An act of sabotage? It was bananas, but then, so much of what we argued about was bananas when you stood back and tried to breathe. At the end of the evening, a woman I'd barely spoken to, Mrs. Back Hargrove, took my hand and said quietly, "This used to be a place where neighbors borrowed sugar. Now we set up rules for borrowing." Her words sat with me like a stone in a pocket. We were unmooring ourselves from the ordinary kindnesses that make suburban life possible, and in doing so we replaced bread and sugar with a ledger. Cold fronts in October bring clarity. Leaves fall, people's facades show. The board sent out an updated rule packet that week with changes. It was long, and long documents are their own species of intimidation. It included explicit language about permitted bench colors, fence exceptions, and a new enforcement tier system with escalating fines. Fines are always the final weapon. There's something banally terrifying about a document that suggests financial consequences for mismatched holiday lights. When you read that paragraph, you feel the possibility of your weekend suddenly being monetized. Some people cheered the new clarity. Some saw it as weaponizing the HOA. Carl, in particular, felt targeted. He received a preliminary notice because his fence exceeded the tolerance by 2 inches, and the notice included a photo taken from an angle that made the measurement look exaggerated. He was furious. He hired a surveyor, of course, because that's what you do when you don't trust the pictures people take of your property. Jen proposed an amendment to add a clause allowing for compassionate exceptions for memorials. Marissa bristled. You could tell it bothered her that grief might be used to undermine her aesthetic regime. The more emails that flew, the more people took positions, and positions become identities. You're either with the aesthetic guardians or the privacy advocates or the memorial sympathizers. My own identity felt flimsy in comparison, more of a spectator. But even spectators became implicated. I started noticing who I invited to my garden party, who I greeted with a wave, and who I stopped returning phone calls to. Small social algorithms emerged. Give one favor, expect a ledger entry, offer empathy, receive suspicion. We began to keep mental inventories. That's when I realized the cost wasn't just in fines, it was in the small accrual of distrust. It's amazing how quickly a community can calculate you into a column labeled Other. I hadn't planned on being a participant in the next chapter, but the universe interrupted with a leak in my roof. I called Omar to patch it because he was the only person I trusted to fix things without producing a PDF. While he was on my porch, he casually mentioned he'd seen someone painting the bench in the early hours. Blue, again. "Maybe it's an act," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Maybe it's a message." He shrugged, like a man who had seen more than his fair share of yard drama. I felt oddly involved. The bench had become less of a public memorial and more of a political litmus test. A week later, there was an anonymous postcard in my mailbox accusing me of taking sides. I had not. That postcard was the first time I felt truly targeted, not in the way of an impersonal HOA notice, but in the messy way of a neighbor scrawling their suspicion at you. I started thinking about the lines we draw, fences, property lines, the lines of who we invite to communal events. Someone had decided I was on the wrong side, and their evidence was shorthand. My name had been mentioned in the thread. I had once liked a social post supporting Jen. Guilt by association in subdivisions is a potent thing. I went to see Marissa after that, partly because I wanted to know who else had a painting favor, and partly because I wanted to see how a woman who had directed so much order handled personal ugliness. She met me in her kitchen, which smelled faintly of eucalyptus, and said quietly, "I don't like what this has made of us." Her eyes were tired in a way that no spreadsheet could explain. For a second, she looked like a person who had been asked to carry other people's grief and gotten buried. It was a rare vulnerability. I wanted to comfort her, because being cruel to the powerful feels like a relief, but it's possible to be both wrong and right about you. She told me she feared the bench had become a totem for people's resentment of rules. I told her I thought it had become a mirror. Winter made the politics colder and quieter. Snow brings a sort of forced truce. People have to shovel, and the shared labor softens the edges. But it also gives people time to scheme indoors. In January, the board received a petition, anonymous of course, asking for Marissa's resignation as HOA president for overreach and misuse of funds. The petition had signatures. Some were real, some were not. When you live in a small community, signatures on a dotted line are both validation and potential forgery. The petition's existence had been expected, like a thunderstorm forecast in a season of rain. People buzzed and braced. Marissa's reaction surprised me. She didn't fight like a cornered animal. She issued an invitation to a special general meeting and sent a transparent audit instead. The audit was dense, and dense documents often cloak things. But the auditors cleared her of financial wrongdoing. That didn't stop the rumor mill from running. Rumors are the currency of suspicion, and they have a gruesome ROI. Someone suggested Marissa had been using HOA funds for private renovations. Someone else suggested she used the paint budget for a living room palette to impress friends. The rumor that refuses to die does something to your neighbors. It reveals their delight in gossip and their willingness to believe the worst. Carl used the meeting to press his fence case again, and Theo, showing signs of fatigue from legal drafting, defended process. "We must be fair," he said, "like a judge who knows the law is as much a performance as a tool." Jen read a prepared statement about empathy in the bench, and announced a fundraiser to refurbish it in an approved palette. Her polished words landed with a weight that suggested ambition. I watched her and thought, perhaps unfairly, about how grief and ambition sometimes occupy the same space. People who are good at leading can turn personal narratives into mobilizing rhetoric. That's useful in PTA and dangerous on narrow lanes. At the end of the night, someone unknown stood and proposed adding an amendment to require that all memorials on common property be approved by a 2/3 board vote. It passed with a handful of votes. It was a small democracy, moving quietly toward more paperwork. We left the meeting with the usual mixture of relief and resentment. I walked home thinking about how our compulsion to regulate had replaced our habit of neighborliness. When we choose rules over relationships, we foster a bureaucracy of grief. The cost is measured not just in fines but in the little kindnesses we stop doing because we're busy counting. Spring came back with a bluster and a final act that nobody had been ready for. Late one evening, someone chained the bench to the lamp post and circled it with solar lights. The chain was thick, like an absurd sign of warding. A note hung from the chain. Protected by the people. It was both moving and provocative. A public statement that said, in effect, we are tired of being regulated out of humanity. The next morning, Marissa arrived with a letter from an attorney. The letter demanded the removal of the chain and lights. It called the ensemble an unauthorized structure. The spectacle escalated. What followed were human rituals, vigils, petition signings, and discreet acts of sabotage. Someone peeled off the solar lights and left them scattered like a broken promise. Someone else placed a small plaque next to the bench that read, "For Lily, and for everyone who grieves in public." The plaque was humble and illegible at a distance, but its existence was incendiary. Suddenly, the bench was less about a color and more about who got to memorialize loss in public spaces. Old grievances reappeared, who had been excluded from grief, who had been chosen to represent it, and who wanted grief to be private and neat and unnoticeable. The pressure cooker built in our community room. The board deliberated in hushed tones, then out loud, then theatrically. Marissa, who had tried to make everything a matter of clarity, looked cornered. She made a motion to remove the bench entirely, citing liability and precedent. Theo, who had been avoiding the bench conversation for months, abstained, and that abstention was an act of meaning. Jen organized a fundraiser picnic to pay for legal fees if it came to it. It felt like a small war written in PTA terms, bake sale fundraisers in case of court. When you reduce conflict to canned goods and square cookies, you reveal how desperate you are to keep things on a human scale. By then, alliances had solidified. There were the Block A people who believed in uniformity and property values, and there were the Block B people who believed community meant public grief had a place. Somewhere in the middle were the pragmatists who wanted fewer fines and more compromise. I used to think you could hold two truths simultaneously, that a neighborhood should be attractive and that it should be tender. But tender is messy and often at odds with tidy rulebooks. The crucial evening came when someone, fed up with paper and polite procedures, organized a late-night gathering around the bench. It was unauthorized, of course. People brought folding chairs and thermoses and stories. Someone read a poem. Someone else passed around a photo of Lily. A couple of teenagers performed a song. And under the cracked streetlight, our neighbors looked like people again rather than case studies. It was the kind of thing that collapses cynicism for a moment. You remember why you live here. And then, because life is rarely clean, Someone took a video and posted it in the neighborhood chat with the caption, "Look at these idiots wasting HOA time." The video lit up with opinions, some tender, some scornful. In the aftermath, a few of the more conservative board members threatened suspension for participating in unauthorized gatherings on common property. That felt petty and cruel, like punishing people for being human. I got caught up in the energy and found myself scribbling a note in defense of the picnic, failing to realize how polarized I'd become. The irony was heavy. Defending a spontaneous act of humanity got folded into the bureaucracy we were trying to escape. It's almost laughable, except of course it isn't. The winter's legal motions had cooled, but not the personal aftershocks. There were faces we avoided at the mailbox, conversations we didn't have at school pickups, and a collective fatigue that tasted like overcooked coffee. Then, a turning point that felt less like victory and more like surrender. The board voted to commission a small garden around the bench, officially landscaped, with low-maintenance native plants and a plaque with a neutral inscription. It was compromise dressed in cement. The plaque read something like, "In memory of those we cherish." It was intentionally vague. Vague is an excellent tool for moving past conflict, because it demands nothing specific, and thus disappoints everyone equally. When the shovels went into the ground, people came out to plant and to watch. It was crowded and awkward, like any post-war town hall picnic. Marissa attended and planted lavender with a stubborn grace. Carl handed a shovel to one of Jen's kids. Theo took photos like a man cataloging an exhibit that had finally moved into storage. I dug my hands into the earth and felt the small, honest satisfaction of ordinary labor. There was a humility in working alongside people who had once been enemies. For a few hours, the lane resembled itself again. But the compromise was also an erasure. The bench was officially tamed, sanded, stained, and painted a tone that could not be described as love. The plaque said the right things, but its neutrality masked the fight it had ended. We had settled the dispute, yes, but we had also traded something. Specificity for civility, passion for a municipal soothing. People who had been loud in their convictions felt silenced in their satisfaction. You could hear the quiet grumbling, the small accounts being balanced in private. Compromise had healed some things and masked others. The real cost was the intimacy we surrendered when we chose rules as armor. Months later, when the garden looked used but peaceful, someone, maybe a teenager, maybe a forgetful adult, left a single paper cup on the bench. It was not a gesture meant to be symbolic, just stupidity or laziness. I picked it up, tossed it in my bag, and took it home. The cup sat on my counter like evidence. I didn't know why I held on to it until I realized I hadn't wanted to throw away the reminder that things remain imperfect. We'd navigated bylaws and fines and messy human grief, and we had come to a kind of truce not because we had solved anything profound, but because we had grown exhausted, and because some universal instinct told us to stop fighting at our own front doors. That cup was a small artifact of a bigger truth. When rules replace relationships, you can tidy the outside, but you can't clean the inside. We had built a garden around a bench to appease both the guardians of sameness and the keepers of memory, and the garden looked lovely in pictures, tidy, balanced, neutral. But when I sat there once, late in the afternoon, children's laughter in the distance, I felt all the old arguments like a kind of static under the grass. We'd traded the messy freedom of spontaneous remembrance for sanctioned rituals. We'd learned how to file grievances and how to draft exceptions. We had also learned how to withhold invitations. In the end, the truth I tell you now is not that anyone was wholly right or wholly wrong. It's that ordinary people, when backed by grief and fear, will create theater out of rules and mistakes, out of love. We were small and stubborn and capable of both petty cruelty and deep compassion. Marissa still walks the lane with her clipboard. Carl's fence remains, painted to code. Jen still organizes bake sales. Theo still drafts clauses. And sometimes, on a Sunday afternoon, when the light hits the hydrangeas just right, I see someone sitting on the bench, cup in hand, quietly watching kids chase one another. For a moment, everything feels reconciled, not because we fixed the root causes, but because we refused, temporarily, to let the lane tear us further apart. And perhaps that's the best we can do. Keep a bench, plant a garden, and try, imperfectly, to be neighbors.